Tremors is a fun comedy sci-fi thriller about a town that discovers the surrounding desert is full of enormous worms that are starting to attack the citizens. It was especially fun to watch this shortly after Them, which also features oversized creepy crawlies born from nuclear experimentation, but where Them was solemn and cautionary, Tremors is playful and high energy. We get a beautifully distinct cast of characters, each of whom bring their own perspectives and solutions to the table, and watching them interact and try tactic after tactic to save their town is just such a fun ride. There's not a lot of depth to either plot or character growth, but that's not what the film is trying to do, so it's not really missed. While I don't typically lean into gross-out horror, some of the worm death moments are viscerally icky in a way that I really enjoyed. In a couple moments, I laughed out loud at how unexpectedly gooey it was. Overall, a delightful watch that I had a good time with. X is a horror film about a group of young adults who rent out an old, mostly empty farm in which to shoot an adult film, while the owners of the farm lurk around being generally ominous. And then people start dying. It's kind of a vague horror story that leans more into the vibe than into clear narrative answers for anything that's happening. And while that mostly works, I do find myself wishing I had a deeper understanding of what the actual motivation was for any of these characters. Without that, though, it's still a semi-interesting slasher pick with a creative atmosphere. And after this and Infinity Pool, I am fully on the Mia Goth train. She brings such an unusual energy to both those films, and while I forgot about the details of the movies pretty quickly after watching them, the image of Mia Goth wandering through the world sticks with me. I know I've sworn off franchises, but I am tempted to go ahead and watch Pearl, the companion piece to this one, to see if it is a more satisfying watch than this one. Blood Freak is a grainy 1970s B horror movie about a man who becomes a marijuana addict and then, partly turns into a turkey that eats the blood of other addicts. On the surface, this sounds like a delightfully wacky premise for a movie, sort of Reefer Madness style. But as far as an actual bad movie watching experience, it feels more along the lines of Manos Hands of Fate. Mostly slow and tedious and low quality enough that it's unpleasant to sit through without a group of folks riffing it with you. The video and audio quality are low enough that I frequently struggled to follow what was going on. In fact, I was only fully clear on the plot thanks to Wikipedia, and it's full of dull moralizing about the meaning of the movie that is somehow both overly didactic and vague. This isn't one that's going to make it into my regular rotation of cheesy B movies anytime soon. The Woman King is inspired by the true story of a group of all-female warriors in West Africa. Viola Davis plays their general, and we see her train new recruits, lead battles against threats, and reveal pieces of her mysterious past. This movie looks great, with rich cinematography, costuming, and lighting in a way that highlights the near-legendary status of these warriors. At the end of the day, though, this is a very good movie that is just mostly not for me. It's political historical action, and while I love that it focuses its attention on characters who usually don't get the spotlight, the tropes of those genres are still very much present, and fail to hold my interest for long. Davis is, of course, always excellent in any role she tackles, and it's worth watching even just for her. And if you have any interest in this part of history or just want to see an action movie set somewhere different, this is also one to check out. The Taking of Pelham 123 is the story of a train that is hijacked by 4 criminals and the law enforcement officials trying to get the hostages released. It's a pretty engaging story as thrillers go. I was particularly interested in how it showed all the many, many bureaucratic threads that intertwine to keep things up and running, and how difficult it is to keep life going when something falls apart. I do wish that in all that jumping from viewpoint to viewpoint and seeing everyone's response to the hostage taking, that we got a little bit more of the hostages themselves at the center of this crisis. We get the smallest glimpse into their lives, and it really would have turned up the human aspect of the tension if we had gotten to know them a bit better. That being said, though, it's an interesting film, if emotionally distant, and definitely worth it for fans of the genre. The Faculty is a light horror thriller set inside a high school where aliens are taking over the faculty. A small group of students figure it out and try to find a way to defeat them before they take over the whole school and then the world. This is exactly the goofy, gooey teen horror I wanted it to be, with lots of aesthetically fun, if not wholly realistic, effects showing the creatures taking over the teachers' bodies. The character development is light, but just fun enough to make it easy to root for our heroes, and they lean in and out of their school stereotypes in some fun and surprising ways, which makes it extra enjoyable when they're trying to figure out which one of them may be an alien in disguise. Overall, a good fluffy watch. I would be surprised if anyone doesn't know the gist of the Barbie movie, but here goes. It's Greta Gerwig's take on adapting the classic children's doll to a film narrative. We follow Margot Robbie as classic Barbie in Barbie Land as she has a bit of an existential crisis and has to enter the real world to find her purpose again. Gerwig and I seldom see eye to eye in her films, and that mostly holds true here when it comes to her female leads. Ryan Gosling as Ken absolutely steals the show here, with a far more compelling character arc than Barbie or almost any of her female co-leads, and that's no shade on Robbie, who is a talented actress. Gerwig's experience of femininity is just so drastically different than my own that I don't connect to Barbie any more than I did Lady Bird or her version of Jo March. That being said, it is a very fun movie with lots of jokes that perfectly land and some gorgeous atmospheric set design, and it's worth watching just for the sets and costumes alone. And if your style of storytelling meshes with Gerwig's, I'd imagine it would be an even more enjoyable ride. Ultimately, I personally admire it from a little bit of an emotional distance. The Man Who Came to Dinner follows a famous but ill-tempered writer, played by Monty Woolley, who ends up injuring himself in a small rural town and needing to stay there through the holidays. We watch him making unreasonable demands of his hosts, inserting himself into their business, and disrupting their lives. This is clearly meant as a comedy, but Bette Davis, as the author's long-suffering assistant, is the only person we can really root for in this story, and she's also one of the ones who goes through the most emotional turmoil at the hands of her boss, so I mostly found myself feeling bad for her and hating our titular Man Who Came to Dinner. I think there's supposed to be a begrudging, he's the worst, but it's all going to work out love-hate relationship with him, but I just hated him, and it made it hard to buy into any level of heartwarming that the ending is meant to be. The dialogue is witty, there are some good one-liners in here, but other than that, it doesn't work for me as a story, much less a holiday story, and I'm not likely to rewatch it anytime soon. Follow Thru is a 1930 romantic comedy about a talented female golfer pretending she doesn't know anything about golf, so the famous golfer she's in love with will teach her. It's an early color musical and is a surprising look at female athletes in the 30s. While the individual pieces of this don't necessarily stand out as anything special, the concept of the story is a lot more interesting than most of the 1930 romances I've been watching. My biggest beef with this movie, though, is the almost unwatchably irritating subplot where Jack Haley is unable to talk to women. I found it, as the kiddos say, or have said, so cringe that I actually did wince a few times when the character reappeared on screen. So overall, while I wanted to appreciate what this film was bringing, there weren't enough positives and at least one enormous negative that pulled it down. Certain Women is a movie following a group of 3 women who all have loose connections and showing us them going through their lives, encountering career battles and love life battles. On the surface, this seems like something I would really be into, but the slice of life format that this leans into means that none of the stories have an arc that I find satisfying or interesting. I get that they're all intended to be unresolved, but it made it hard for me to connect with the film. I also don't entirely get why these 3 particular women were grouped together to tell their stories. I can't quite find the right thematic through line to make sense of the 3 of them together. This is the kind of movie that some folks will absolutely fall in love with, but it left me a little cold in the end. A Jazzman's Blues tells the story of an African-American man in the South in the 40s who flees the vengeful white lawmen of his town and ends up becoming an acclaimed jazz performer in a nightclub. I'm pretty sure this is my first Tyler Perry movie, and it's definitely got a distinctive feel that reminds me of a cross between presentational theater and schlocky CW dramas. While I love my fair share of those, I couldn't quite settle into this vibe. I kept being put off by the soap opera-style dramatic revelations and how expository all the dialogue was. It does have some really enjoyable musical numbers, and I kept feeling myself just on the edge of enjoying it for real in its own unique flavor. It definitely makes me want to watch more Perry films and see if a little more exposure can help me settle into it and have a good time with it, even if this one didn't quite do the trick for me. Whitney Houston, I Want to Dance with Somebody is a musical biopic of Whitney Houston's musical career. It follows her from her early breakthrough to her relationship with Bobby Brown, to her substance abuse issues, to her untimely death. The music numbers all use Houston's original vocals, with actress Naomi Ackie lip-syncing along to them. Like so many biopics, this tries so hard to fit every aspect of Houston's life in that it fails a little bit as a narrative because it can't quite cohere them into something with a thematic through line. And of course, that's because life itself doesn't have a thematic through line, but it still makes me wish I'd watched a documentary about Houston's life rather than this somewhat lifeless interpretation of her work. In fact, it did do the one thing that a good documentary about Houston's life should absolutely do, which was make me want to go and actually listen to her music. There's not a lot to be gained from dramatizing it the way it is here. It's a harmless biopic primarily, but it's also an uninteresting one. Most of my life, I just thought of Deep Impact as being the other asteroid movie that wasn't Armageddon. And while both films do deal with a celestial object that is on a collision course with the Earth for an extinction-level event, Armageddon primarily deals with the attempt to dismantle the asteroid, while Deep Impact spends a lot more time on the Earth with the people who are actually having to come to terms with the fact that they are in their final days. That, to me, is a much more compelling story, even if it is occasionally told clumsily here. There are some genuinely thoughtful and well-scripted moments where characters realize either they or someone they love is not going to make it into the bunker that will shelter humanity from extinction. And the scenes of destruction and damage to the Earth seem a lot more, no pun intended, impactful than they were in Michael Bay's explosion-happy style. The movie absolutely has clunky points where exposition is awkward and characters have abrupt changes of heart for no real reason, but there are more high points to this one than I expected. Memories of Murder is a Bong Joon-ho movie from South Korea, based loosely on an actual string of murders committed in the country that went for years without being solved. Interestingly, the killer confessed to the murders after this movie came out, and I believe I even read that he had indeed seen the movie, so there's a weird fact. The story centers primarily on the police, who are trying to track down this killer, and on how easy they find it to do terrible things, like torturing suspects and planting evidence that will lead to a conviction, even if they know that it's not accurate. Like many of Bong's movies, I found myself having to go look this one up after I was finished with it to help me process how it ended. It's in many ways a typical crime procedural, but the casualness of the police cruelty really builds to an unsettling climax in the final scenes. It's not the kind of story that I typically seek out, but I think it is well told, and I think Bong Joon-ho is a master at his craft, so it's no surprise that this is a very well-crafted film. I wonder if I return to it after a little time if it will have a stronger impact on me, because even after just one viewing, I can feel the weight. Oppenheimer is Christopher Nolan's biopic of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was fundamental in creating the atomic bomb. In traditional Nolan nonlinear fashion, we hop around between Oppenheimer's early days, his work during World War II, a revoking of his security clearance years later based on his communist associations during the McCarthy era, and finally a hearing where one of the senators who worked with him is interrogated about their connection. The sequences involving the bombs are big and terrifying and all-encompassing in a way that I wish I'd seen in theaters. It would be incredibly effective. It was effective enough on a tiny tablet 5 inches from my face. I also really enjoyed the twist in the final quarter of the film, which was something I probably should have seen coming, but the fact that I didn't is a good indicator that I was wrapped up in the narrative, and it distracted me, and I was taken by surprise. The film does get a little bit muggy in its exploration of the ethics of creating this kind of weapon. It plays with that a little bit, but muddles it up with questions about McCarthyism in a way that doesn't serve it well. And of course, there's the problem we have with all movies in this genre of difficult genius, which is Oppenheimer is a deeply unpleasant man to spend 3.5 hours with. So, while the technical elements are flawless and the storytelling is effective, it's not a game changer for me, and I don't think it's Nolan's best work, but worth a watch. Henry V is a 1940s adaptation of the Shakespeare play of the same name, starring Laurence Olivier as King Henry. The plot is a pretty straightforward war story, but it's the set design and technical details that set this one apart. The first act is set up as if it is a filmed live performance within Shakespeare's Globe Theatre itself, complete with audience reactions to the jokes and occasional glimpses of backstage shenanigans. However, as the story goes on, the sets become more and more realistic and ultimately leave that gimmick behind. I wish that I had spent the whole movie in that gimmick, because it was the most interesting piece of it. Granted, I'll admit that I don't like this play to begin with. I find it tedious, with nothing for me to grab onto narratively, but because of that, it was exciting for me to initially see a unique take on it. And the entire film is steeped in these gorgeous Technicolor designs and hues that absolutely make it beautiful to look at. It's probably my own fault that this is not the show to win me over, but I did love looking at the sets and costumes. OMG, Oh My God is an Indian movie about an atheist storekeeper who loudly denounces his faith in God, only for his shop to be destroyed in an earthquake. The insurance company won't pay out since it's considered an act of God, so he goes to court to argue that either the insurance company or God himself should pay to replace his shop. And along the way, God actually shows up. This is actually kind of a fascinating look at a very religious society that is not the one I grew up in, but certainly shares some similarities. And it examines how easy it is for those in power to use religion as a way to take advantage of people in need. It's easy to root for our main character as he fights against the greedy leaders, and every win he gets feels like a win. Even when the supernatural actually makes its way into the story, it's very much reinforcing the idea that the best aspects of religious groups are those that help those in need, which is very close to my own personal faith beliefs. I say all this as if the movie is some kind of deep treatise on faith and religion, when mostly it's just a fun courtroom comedy, which it does pretty well, but there is also some deeper food for thought in here. Till is a biopic about the lynching of Emmett Till in the 1950s, and his mother's efforts to bring about justice for his killing. As you might expect from the subject matter, this is a heavy story. Till's mother, Mamie, is played beautifully by Danielle Deadwyler, moving believably between the moments of enormous emotion and the times where she has to steel herself to get through her work. There are pieces of the story I did not know that were told very effectively here. For example, I was slightly taken aback by the graphicness of the dead body, but then when Mamie decides to hold an open casket funeral for her son, I immediately understood and agreed that it was essential for us as the audience to also see that body and its bloated, discolored horror. No telling of the story is going to have much of a resolution. History doesn't allow for that resolution, but it's an important piece of our history that continues to be far too relevant to today, and this version is an effective and powerful way to pass on that history. Cradle Will Rock is a historical drama about the 1937 musical production Cradle Will Rock, a leftist pro-union show that was abruptly shut down before its transfer to Broadway. The film follows the production up through its opening night, as well as highlighting several other events that, while not strictly accurate in terms of historical timeline, help to paint a picture of a general attitude surrounding art and politics in the 1930s. I knew absolutely nothing about this movie going into it, and having seen it, my main question is, why had nobody recommended this to me before? A movie about the power of musical theater is already basically tailor-made for me, let alone the political commentary. I'm a little stunned I didn't know about it. While the soul-stirring final performance of the musical is the movie's highlight, I really love all the little stories we have running throughout. In perfect ensemble drama fashion, each one hits its essential narrative pieces without ever overstating its welcome, and we get completely delightful performances in smaller roles. Vanessa Redgrave is my personal favorite. That ending musical performance takes up a good chunk of the film's runtime, but it deserves it, and it helps everything hit home. While we'll see if it wows me as much on a rewatch, I was thoroughly delighted with this movie on my first viewing, and I'm so glad I finally got to see it. All the Best Fun Begins is a Bollywood comedy about a man who's been financially supported by his brother for years and has been lying about being married so he gets more money. But when his brother unexpectedly shows up for a visit, expecting to meet the wife, chaos ensues. I appreciate the length of this movie, partly because it took me a good hour or so to settle into the very broad, occasionally cartoonish sense of humor, but once I did, I had a good time. Everything's exaggerated, with the least likely misunderstandings ballooning into entire subplots. But amid all the larger-than-life chaos, what really clinched it for me was the occasional heartfelt moment that provided just enough personal investment in the characters to make the rest of the comedy work better. So goofy, so silly, but absolutely good for a lighthearted watch. Race for Glory Audi vs. Lancia portrays the rivalry between car manufacturers Audi and Lancia to win the 1983 Rally World Championship. Our focus is on Lancia, the underdog who has yet to win and is scrambling to keep up with Audi's technological advances. This film was not helped by the fact that I had just watched Ford v Ferrari in the couple months before this, because this absolutely feels just like a cheap knockoff, all the way down to the personal drama between the team manager and the stick-it-to-the-man driver. This one isn't particularly well written or well acted or well filmed, and the racing scenes are far from riveting. The character development we do get is thin and rushes through emotional beats that should take their time. This was the first movie I watched from 2024, and my viewings of that year were not off to a terribly exciting start. Shame stars Michael Fassbender as a man with sex addiction who finds himself struggling to make real-world emotional connections. Like so many of the best films dealing with issues of addiction, there's a deeply grimy and unpleasant sheen to this whole film, and our main character Brandon's sexual encounters aren't shown to us in a way that's at all erotic, just dismal and empty, particularly during the final third. The ending is deliberately ambiguous, and while I like the choice on paper, it didn't land quite as well as I wanted it to. I think I needed a bit more wind-down aftermath than we got for it to wholly grip me. That being said, though, this is a fascinating movie, and one that I think is going to sit with me the more I think about it. Writing a review right after watching it almost feels a little unfair, like I haven't fully finished it because this one needs time to digest, so I may have to mentally revisit it in a month or so and see if it's settled into a more clear place in my mind. Fast and Loose is a 1930 romantic drama about two rich siblings who each fall in love with lower-class partners and have to navigate that social scenario. It was fun to see a very young Carol Lombard in the role of the chorus girl who falls in love with the rich young man, as well as Frank Morgan as the rich father. Other than that, though, this is a pretty thin story. It depends on two different love stories, and at least in the ending, frames them as equally important, but we hardly ever see Lombard's plot. It's maybe 2 minutes total of them interacting. The love story that does get more attention is centered heavily on him taunting her for being a useless, foolish woman, which isn't terribly captivating either, even if it's meant playfully. The final scene puts a little bit more of an interesting spin on the story, but it's too little too late in a love story with not much to lean on. Knock at the Cabin is a home invasion movie about a couple and their young daughter being held hostage by four strangers who claim that the world will end unless one of the family members is willingly sacrificed. This is Shyamalan's best script in a long time, possibly because he adapted someone else's draft script rather than starting from scratch. He should do that more often, and it does an excellent job of bringing out the existential terror of the apocalypse. Dave Bautista gives an especially good dramatic performance, weighing his character down with a mix of tragedy and compassion. I also understand people who are unhappy with the ending. I understand it differs significantly from the book, but the story as a whole is crafted well enough that the ending oddly didn't seem to matter as much to me. It feels like it's not about how it ends, but the decisions that are made along the way. This is a movie that makes me remember why I liked Shyamalan back in the old days in the first place. Flora and Son is the newest movie from John Carney, who always delivers charming, music-centric films, most notably Once and Sing Street. This isn't quite as great as either of those, but it's still a lovely watch. Flora, of the title, is an irresponsible mother trying to keep her teenage son, Max, from getting himself in trouble with the law. Over the course of the movie, they both discover they share a love for making music. There's more suspension of belief required to buy into the emotional beats of this movie than Carney sometimes asks of his audience, but it works overall. The final scene is particularly charming, as other people who have played a role in Flora and her son's musical journey join them for the big musical number, and it's impossible not to smile through it. Definitely worth watching, especially if stories about musicians and the arts are already easy for you, but it didn't sweep me away the way that I hoped it would.